Okay, so it looks like we are live. Thank you to everyone who joined us on Facebook or YouTube. I'm Irene Katz-Connelly. I'm a culture writer at The Forward, and I'm joined by the artist Jacqueline Kott-Wolle, although she says you can call her Jackie. Jackie was born in Toronto, Canada, and raised by parents and grandparents who survived the Holocaust and landed in Canada around 1949. She started out as a social worker, and she spent decades working for Jewish communal organizations. But when her family moved to Chicago and only her husband had an American work visa, she decided to throw herself into her art and painting full time. Right now, she is exhibiting a series of really wonderful, vivid portrait-style paintings called Growing Up Jewish that deals with her parents' travails as survivors and immigrants, as well as her own distinctly North American Jewish experience. We're going to talk about them, and if you have questions, you can put them in the comments section, and we'll try to answer some of them at the end. How are you doing, Jackie?
I am great. Thank you, Irene, for hosting me in The Forward. It's funny, I remember my Zadie reading the Yiddish Forwards when I was a little girl, and I'd go visit him at his fabric store. So it's kind of full circle being here.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see an image of that fabric store.
Yes.
So, you've been painting for a long time, but this is your first series that deals specifically with Jewish life. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got into art and what you were working on before?
Absolutely. So let's talk about myself as an artist. That was something that was obvious from a very young age. Every single one of my report cards said the same thing year after year. Jackie talks too much and she's good at art. So not surprisingly, most of my math notebooks, my machberet at Hebrew school had very elaborate doodles and drawings. I had a stint with ceramics on the side. So painting and drawing is something that I've always taken and included in my life, even as I was practicing social work. But like you mentioned earlier, when we moved to Chicago, I actually found a wonderful art school near my home called the Art Center of Highland Park, and I started taking classes there. And in the beginning, I was focusing mostly on painting off of vintage family photos. I sort of like that quality of old photos, and I would capture a lot of summer moments, really simple, easy to look at images of my family at pools and lakes and beaches. There's one painting here called Moment at Union Pier that maybe we can show in that slide, which shows a little bit of how I like to paint before I started this process of exploring Jewish identity through my art. So I don't know if we can pull that slide up, but let's see if there it is. Yes. This is typical of something that I would paint. Very straightforward, no explanation required, just a moment in time captured first in a photograph and then by me in painting.
Yeah, and I know you told me that when you were growing up and as a younger artist, you sort of thought of quote unquote Jewish art as like the picture of the bearded old rabbi hanging over the mantelpiece in the traditional family home. Was there some sort of like light bulb moment when you came to see yourself as making Jewish art or having something to offer when it comes to this genre?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. And there's a good story there, I suppose. So one of the things that I will say growing up and then even now is my family, we were considered like the big Jews growing up. We were in a comfortable Jewish-ish neighborhood in Toronto and likewise here outside of Chicago. But people were more or less secular. We were like the only family that had a sukkah. My parents were the founding members of our conservative movement synagogue, which we attended every week. I worked, as you mentioned, in Jewish communal service for many years. So there are these two sides of my personality, very closely identified with my Jewish community and also with my art. And so I'd often be asked, why don't you paint Jewish art? And so I had this moment of like, well, I don't even know what I would paint because I like bathing suits. What would I paint? And plus I have these really strong associations about what I thought it should look like based on the Jewish themed paintings that hung in our family home, like the rabbi, the classic rabbi. So I think we'll see that in a moment. There's an image of my sister and I in the 1970s with the rabbi painting behind us. this old bearded, stern-faced rabbi presided over many episodes of The Love Boat and Fantasy Island in the TV room of our home. And I mentioned Irene as I met you. I am a little bit older than you, but I know growing up, going to people's homes or their grandparents' homes, you always saw the classic rabbi painting. So there he is, the stern-faced, bearded rabbi of old. And so I had to kind of examine, well, if I'm going to paint Jewish art, it's got to feel like the Judaism I grew up with. And that man felt so disconnected from my Jewish experiences on the ground. So, for example, I don't think that man went to Jewish summer camp, but that was where most of my formative Jewish experiences happened. So, and I also thought, my rabbi looked nothing like this man. He had no beard and he wore turtlenecks. So I actually made a painting. I started there. I thought, well, why don't I paint a picture of my rabbi? So I think we have a slide of the conservative rabbi and his wife, Leona. There he is. So I started digging up photos at my parents' house, and I started to see that we had hundreds and hundreds of Jewish moments captured by my dad with his Leica camera. And I thought, well, what if I paint these images and try and create a series that explores the Judaism I grew up with, so that I could challenge my conceptions of what I thought Jewish art should look like and do what I really lived through. So here we are.
Absolutely. Your style, which we're going to see a lot more of, is sort of really vibrant, very colorful, very expressionistic. And you said that you're inspired by Fairfield Porter, who, for anyone watching who doesn't know, is a mid-20th century artist whose work really depicts family life in these sort of wealthy, waspy enclaves. Why is it significant to you to apply that aesthetic to your own community, which was much more immigrant, working class, Jewish, Canadian?
Yes. So when I started painting, I gravitated toward color. My mother is an artist. She definitely had a very free spirit and approach to color. She did a lot of landscapes. And my art teacher, and I was attracted to more figures and capturing sort of moments. And my art teacher actually introduced me to the work of Fairfield Porter, and I loved it. I thought there was something so colorful, light-filled, intimate moments of these people living the beautiful life. I don't know if it spoke to some deep psychological thing in my experience. I know, I'm dating myself. We all had the preppy handbook growing up. We watched movies like Dead Poets Society. There was a certain sort of feeling about those images that Fairfield Porter captured. And I felt like there was something so established and lovely about that world. And I also recognized, well, that's not really where my people came from. But nonetheless, as I explored this idea of, well, how do I paint like me, but tell the Jewish story, I actually had this moment where I asked myself, I'm like, well, what would Fairfield Porter's paintings look like if his family was Jewish? And funnily enough, as I was digging through the old photos, I found this one, which has 2 tennis players in the background and my husband's immigrant grandparents in the foreground. And I thought what was so fascinating about it is that here they are sort of in the world of Fairfield Porter with these tennis players, but on the other side of the fence. And I mean, I had the composition is pure coincidence that it came out like this, but it does sort of speak to a little bit of that divide in the community of the immigrant trying to assimilate into the new world and try and find their place amongst what I described here as, in this painting, it's called Greeners, Gaylors, and Fairfield Porter. If anybody's familiar, the term greener means, it was a term used for immigrants who arrived after the Second World War. Greeners, like my parents were greeners, my husband's parents were greeners. I come from greeners. They're people who are newly arrived immigrants. They have accents, and in comparison, there are Gaylors, which my mother-in-law explained to me are people who are like yellow vegetables. Like Gaylor is yellow, means yellow in Yiddish. They've ripened on the vine of America for a long time, and stereotypically they've established themselves in America. They have beach homes. They play tennis. So I just thought this was such a cool confluence of Jewish life here, the Greeners and the Gaylors together in this composition that looked like a Fairfield Porter painting.
Yeah, I love that this painting comes, the photo comes with its own symbolism intact right there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also sort of a powerful act for you as like the daughter of immigrants to sort of position them artistically as like within the center, the center of power and sort of like ease that Fairfield Porter evokes in his own work.
Never thought of that, but you're probably right. There's a lot of layers of things going on here that I'm not even fully aware of that I've done through these paintings. So it is interesting to hear that perspective.
There are, a lot of the images in the series come with these really poignant family stories, and I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more in depth than some of them. And one of the paintings that most struck me was Nobody Asked Auntie Sylvia, which I think we're going to see in a moment. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about Auntie Sylvia and what nobody asked her about.
Absolutely. So Auntie Sylvia was my father's sister. She actually only recently passed away in March. She was a Holocaust survivor. She, together with my father, my grandfather, my great uncle, and my great grandmother, fled to the forest outside of their little village in Poland when war broke out. And they hid in the forest for 19 months. And Sylvia, to me, is like, she is a hero. And I owe her so much. One of the things I owe her is the fact that she saved my father's life. There was an incident in the forest when Zadie and Usher, I'll just refer to them as Zadie and Usher, my grandfather and his brother, went to get food, and for reasons that I won't get into, they got held up and were hiding in someone's attic for 24 hours. And Auntie Sylvia and my father were left alone with my great-grandmother in the forest waiting for them to bring food. Tragically, my great-grandmother froze to death in that moment while they were waiting, and my father was also starting to freeze to death. And Auntie Sylvia was holding him in her arms, and she was feeding him bits of ice to keep him alive. So here's reason one why I owe her my life. I wouldn't be here if she didn't save my father. But then what's so interesting is when Sylvia arrived in Canada, she was a teenager, as was my father, and nobody asked Auntie Sylvia if she would enjoy or benefit from a higher education. In those days, it was, the early 1950s, it was all heaped onto the men. And so all the educational opportunities were sent toward my father, who got to go to university. First, they invested in him getting his matriculation of high school, university, and law school. And Sylvia had to work in the garment factories to basically pay for my dad's education and work in the kitchen to feed the men of the house. So I always felt that Zadie and Usher were incredible men, but they weren't exactly reading, the early feminist writings of Betty Friedan. It was not about feminism or equality for women in those days. Women were just never expected to pursue careers and so forth. So I really felt that I benefited, of course, because there's all kind of opportunity when your family has an education. And Sylvia did go on to raise 5 highly successful children, all of whom got incredible educations and so forth, but she herself personally paid the price. But the other thing I also realized too, and it's becoming clearer and clearer to me, is that if I have questions, I can't ask them anymore. She was the last person from that generation who's still alive. My father, unfortunately, is not alive. And I really do hope that I asked her all the questions that I needed to ask to find out our family story.
And were you able to talk to her during her lifetime about your family's story? Did you have that kind of relationship?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, recently, Irene, we were talking earlier today, you asked me, did I have any interesting things happen to me as a result of making this project? And one of the things that was fabulous was I called my family members all the time to ask family stories so that I could corroborate the things that my father wrote in his memoir, thankfully, and my mom would tell me, and I would call Auntie Sylvia and ask her questions so that I could tell these stories. But amazingly, I also met some family who were lost to us in Chicago. But their family this is a relative of Auntie Sylvia's, immigrated at the turn of the century. The families completely lost touch with each other, and we found each other. And one of the relatives had a whole series of questions about that side of the family. And the last meaningful conversation I had with Sylvia was about the family. So yes, thank goodness we did have, she wanted us to know her story. So.
Yeah, and that must have been meaningful for her too, to see you find this family that had been lost.
Absolutely, she loved that stuff, so.
Another painting I really wanted to talk about is this wonderful ensemble portrait of a 1950 ladies auxiliary tea, which is, both, it's showing us this really conventional activity for women at the time, but it's also telling a story about the challenges of assimilation for these newly arrived Holocaust survivors in Canada. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what's going on under the surface here.
Okay. About a million things are happening here. So let's just look at the visuals of this painting. First of all, painting this was a complete festival for me. I had images of Mrs. Maisel in the background. I love pattern, I love wallpaper, I collect teacups. I love the work of the artist Wayne Thiebaud, and so I sort of gave a little nod to him by painting these cakes. He painted luscious cakes. I researched Jewish bakeries in the 1950s. So I found the black and white cookies and just the jelly and sprinkle cookies, whatever. I was having a ball making this thing. It was a lot of fun for me. But what else is going on here? So in this project, what I wanted to do was create almost like a portrait of Jewish life as I experienced it. And one of the things that I wanted to, I guess, make a nod to are the women who did community work, because I worked in Jewish community and I know what these women did for all kinds of causes, whether it was raising money for Jewish summer camp scholarships, or if it was to open a new wing in the Mount Sinai Hospital, or if it was anything, the food bank, whatever these women did, they did with such flair and such style. They would come to each other's living rooms and do letter writing campaigns and do the hard work of creating clothing banks and so forth. But the reason why this painting is so meaningful and poignant to me is because it's from an image from the 1950s, early 1950s. And I am assuming that what they were doing here was raising funds to support the needs of the newly arrived refugees. So I am pretty sure that my parents were in some shape or form beneficiaries of the fundraising work of women like the ones pictured here. But the other thing that I wanted to address here was that these women, as much as they were adept at providing for the material needs of the refugees, there was a big social divide between the newly arrived Holocaust survivors and the established Jewish community. There was, that generation didn't talk about the Holocaust in those days. On the one hand, it was so overwhelming for the refugees to talk about what they had experienced, and frankly, the established community wasn't all that interested in hearing about it either. That's at least from what I learned from discussions with my mom and books that I've read. And there was sort of this social divide that the established Jewish community didn't want to live necessarily in the same neighborhoods as the refugees. But I felt, though, that they did provide for them. And what was also incredible to me is that within a generation, these social divides disappeared. And I know this firsthand because I'm a second generation and most of my friends descended from these women and these people whose families had been in Canada and North America, the United States for decades already, virtually indistinguishable. So when with my generation, we dated each other, we went to the same universities, the same parties. So that whole social divide didn't exist for me and my friends, but it existed for my parents' and grandparents' generation with the established community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that really interested me about this series is that we have there's a widespread perception from books and movies and Hollywood that Holocaust survivors immediately went on to have happy, healthy, fulfilling, high-achieving lives. And your work really challenges that assumption. Why was that such an important theme for you, and how does it come out in your work?
So there's the reality on the ground, and the reality on the ground was a lot depended on, some of it depended on the the feelings of optimism that you are just innately gifted with or not gifted with. So I have some relatives who are just innately optimistic people, and they were able to come to Canada and just almost stay in survival mode. These are people who had numbers on their arms that just keep pushing forward and building their lives, and they were so grateful to be in Canada, so grateful to have survived and so forth. But on the other hand, there was the reality. And so, for example, my Zadie, seen here, he was the hero in the family during those years in the forest, but that was also the prime of his life. I mean, he went, by the time he arrived in Canada, he was too old, and he didn't speak English, and there was no opportunity for him to become, a success. You often hear of these stories of schmutta peddlers who turn their businesses into like these big names in fashion, but that was not in the cards for Zadie. And it was financially incredibly difficult. So in this image you see here, Zadie, my mom, and me. Actually, I'm the baby here. And growing up, we used to watch slideshows. Like, that was how we were entertained when we were kids. And we would always come across this image, and the conversation was the same every single time. Everyone would go, "Look at Zadie. He looks so terrible in that picture. What an awful image. We should just throw that slide out." But thank God no one did, because this ended up being such an important painting for me, because I really see like that space between my mother and I and him, that opportunity was really reserved for future generations, not for that generation that arrived in North America at the age of 50 and plus. It was like they just had to be resigned. In fact, it was so bad financially for Zadie that they almost actually left and went back to Poland, if you can believe it. But it was a very tough life, and I think that feeling that a life stolen from them, it became really clear. But of course, they got a lot of nachas and Yiddish pride from all of us, and they went on to become grandparents and great grandparents and see their own children make it in this world, and they got pleasure from that, that's for sure. But for themselves, it was a sacrifice.
Yeah. Do you think that when you wanted to start making these paintings that are telling these sort of frank stories that we don't always hear, was your family ready to hear them and ready to participate in the telling?
First of all, I tried to avoid the Holocaust entirely when I started this presentation. I wanted to look at Jewish life in North America. I was troubled by the statistics from the 2013 Pew study and wondering what is going to happen to Judaism in America in the face of freedom. And so I sort of started just looking at what does it mean to be Jewish in America, and what happens when you alter and change Jewish traditions and so forth. And then somewhere along the way, I realized I couldn't avoid the Holocaust when I started making these paintings. And I think, there's enough distance from it that it's almost therapeutic, maybe for certainly my mom and the family, to just talk about these stories. And it's important too. I think, I have a whole generation of nieces and nephews and my own children who are so grateful that somebody is taking responsibility for these stories. And so for me, when I go visit my mom in Canada, I love going through her old photos and pulling them out and going, who's this? Who's that? What's going on in this picture? And so that's how these stories came out. It was incredible to do that. I recommend everybody do that if you can. Get your old photos, sit down, talk to someone, find out who's who.
Yeah. And you also, I think we went through some of the portraits that are focusing on your parents and grandparents' experience, but you also have portraits that are about your own childhood and what it's sort of like to grow up as a greener family. Do you think you sort of reevaluated your own memories or experiences through that?
Sure. Why don't we put up, there's an image of a sukkah. Maybe we can put that one up. And let's see if that will find its way over here, because that to me gave me a little insight into why my family was so not out of step, but different from everybody else. So as I mentioned, we were like the big Jews in our community. We were the only family with a sukkah on display for everyone to see. And I remember being like literally embarrassed that we had this. Our house was sort of perched up high, overlooking the ravine where all the kids crossed to go to our St. Andrews Junior High School. So everyone could see it. I remember like in middle school thinking, this is so horrifying. Like no one does this. Why are we doing this? And I realize now that perhaps some of our Jewish life was informed by the fact that my parents came from the old country, and Judaism was probably a little bit more traditional. There was no reform movement. There was no conservative movement. There was just Jewish. So, you know, I've since grown to love Sukkot, and here we are again, one of the only families in Highland Park, Illinois that puts up a sukkah. I happen to see, it seems to be a little bit trendier. I see more of them, but I love Sukkot now. But at the time, I think, you know, that was certainly a reframing. And then the other thing too was, maybe if we can put up the image of a dignified background. I think it's there. There was a lot of discovery of our family's Holocaust stories through this process. Oh, you don't have that one. Okay. All right. Well, I will describe it anyway. One of the things that I did was I would ask my mom a lot of questions about my great-grandparents, whose stories were never spoken of, because I think they were both, all of my great-grandparents perished at the hands of the Nazis. And this isn't like watching Schindler's List and explaining it. This is, oh, there he is. Yes, this was real. This was real for our family. And so my great-grandparents couldn't bring back to the surface what happened to their own parents. It was like survival mode. If they talked about what happened to their parents being murdered, they probably all would have perished. They would have fallen apart. So I think they immediately went into survival mode, kept pushing forward with their lives, and never talked about these people again, or else they would completely fall apart. And then my mother's generation felt that their stories were too scary to tell the children. So we went through life thinking that they just didn't exist. And so only recently I decided, you know what, I'm going to start asking my mom questions. What happened to the family? And what I did was I actually Googled my great-grandfather's name, Godel Mangel, and imagine my surprise when a photo from a Krakow ghetto identity card uploaded onto my monitor. And there he was. And I showed my mother this picture, and she couldn't believe it. She said she was 5 years old the last time she saw him alive, and she finally told me what happened to him. And essentially, Godel Mangel was the victim of the Shoah's most sinister of crimes. She said to me things like they did science experiments on him, and they did things like injecting him with gasoline. And so I was completely horrified to learn that this was in my family, and this was his story. And I realized that this man has no grave, there's no monument to him, no one's ever talked about him again. And I figured, what am I going to do to honor his story and honor him? And so what I did was I created this painting. But what I wanted to do was sort of take this image that was taken in an act of hatred and do something loving with it. So I superimposed this image of him onto the wallpaper from my dining room, which is the room where great-grandfathers, Godel's great-great-grandchildren come together every week to celebrate Shabbat and continue living our Jewish heritage. So that's what's going on here.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to me. I didn't actually know that was your wallpaper, and it's such a testament to the way that art can sort of help us recuperate the things that have been lost. Actually, you telling me the story reminds me of something you said in passing this morning about how you always thought that your family had no heirlooms because they had to flee Europe, but then you acquired an heirloom through this project. Could you tell that story again?
Yes. So in reference to that painting, the dignified background painting, one of the assignments that I absolutely hated the most growing up in middle school was do a family tree and bring in a family heirloom. And when you're a second generation, you learn to live without old family photos. And that might actually explain why I've done this at all. Like there's probably some deep psychological issue going on here for me, but I'll take that to the therapist, not here. So my mother, when I would say, Mom, who's on the family tree? She would give me the names of like the great grandparents. And I say, do we have any family heirlooms? And she said, no, all of our stuff is at the time, it's like 30 years old. So I felt so deflated and so embarrassed that I would come to school without anything for my assignment. And I remember there was this boy in my class, Teddy. He was from a First Nations family in Canada, and he was wearing his great grandfather's headdress. And I was so jealous of him, like ironic, right? Like, here's this kid who has this family history that he's so proud of, and I have nothing. In any case, one of the benefits of doing this project was I started to make connections with family members that I hadn't spoken to in years. And one of my cousins told me that, in fact, one of my great-grandparents who had immigrated before the Holocaust was a silversmith. And she had in her possession a vase that he had made, and she sent it to me. So I was like beyond delighted to get my own heirloom. I mean, it's only a few generations back, but to me, it might as well be 200 years old. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I have one more question for you, and then I think we're going to put some audience questions up on the screen. I think you're in your studio right now. Am I right?
Actually, I'm in my husband's office. There's just better lighting and internet here, but I threw in a few of my paintings in here.
Okay. Well, I wonder if you could sort of tell me a little bit about your process, or what is involved in turning something from a family snapshot, like a snapshot, into a portrait.
Okay, so we can talk about the portrait of the Kott Textiles painting of my Zadie store. So what I like to do is I'll often take even a black and white photo, and I'll try and figure out how to colorize it. And with Zadie's image, the fabrics in the store, and we always joke, like, maybe if my mom said to me, maybe if his fabrics were this bright and colorful, he might have actually had a go in his business, but his stuff was really drab. And so I reinvented what I thought was going on, what I wanted to see. And what you have here are all kinds of patterns from my family story. So you'll have like the wallpaper from my childhood bedroom. You'll see also just fabrics that we wore in dresses as children. I absolutely love Alex Katz, and he does this whole thing with green and white polka dots in some of his paintings. So I do a little nod to Alex Katz with these green and white polka dots. And I also, because these images are all over the place, there's a Seder in one, there's a swimming pool in another, there's an old Holocaust survivor in another. I tried to use that green and white polka dot to sort of link this whole series together, so you see it repeat. And then another pattern that repeats itself as well is the red and white polka dots, in part because I love the pattern, but in a more serious note, one of the things that my father remarked in his memoir was that my great-grandmother, when she froze to death in the forest, she was wearing a red and white polka dotted dress. And I felt like I needed to sort of show that her spirit, whatever she's with us through all the generations, that she shows up here, behind Zadie, that was his mother. She shows up in an image of my mom traveling through Israel wearing a polka dotted dress. It was her first trip to Israel. It just shows up repeatedly as just like a thread, mind the reference, but a thread to kind of connect her generations to this.
I'm so sorry. I just got a phone call. I'm not sure.
Oh, no.
Could hear that. Yeah, that is really, and I mean, it's sort of an explanation for your Zadie's kind of downcast. It sort of is the background to why he is sort of distressed in this portrait.
Yeah, I guess so.
I think we have a couple questions from the audience, which maybe we could put one of those on screen. Benjamin has a question. From start to finish, how long does it take to make one of these paintings?
Oh, it depends how inspired I am. Sometimes I can do it in, 3-4 sessions, where I'll come into the studio, let's say at 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. I'll work until 4, 5, 6 in the evening. Then I got to feed people because they eat every day. And I'll do that for a few days straight, and I will have something that's layered and elaborate and goes on and on and on. Other times, it takes forever for whatever reason. It doesn't come as easily, especially if I'm trying to colorize a black and white, because to sort of recreate an image in color and to really sort of make everything work, technically work. I'll struggle, I'll scrape it off, I'll start again. And so it does depend on, if I act in that moment of supreme inspiration, I can crack it out and just get it done really, really quickly. You can imagine though, the Kott textiles took many, many weeks though. That was a lot of research and a lot of, fine detailed work, getting all those fabrics down.
Yeah. Someone else asked in the comment section about the clothes and where the clothes come from. And I know you said that before you were painting specifically scenes of Jewish life, like you were doing a lot with bikinis and bathing suits. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about clothing in the paintings.
Well, I'm actually glad that you put this one up, because a lot of Jewish immigrants, of course, worked in the garment factories. So amazingly, to my young eyes, all those survivors were supremely fashionable. Like, they wore clothes that fit properly and, were sort of, they never left the house without lipstick. They were really, maybe not Zadie, like you saw Zadie's in the very drab thing, but my mother's side of the family particularly, the women in the family, because of that garment factory experience, they would never go out in jeans. Like, they were always wearing dresses and so forth. But what I love about here was, for my parents' wedding, my father used to work in the garment factories in the summer, and he arranged for one of the seamstresses at the factory to copy a Dior gown for my mom to wear at the wedding. And this is the copy of the gown. It was outstanding. She actually dyed it black so she could wear it to her brother's wedding. It was
oh my gosh.
A beautiful dress.
Yeah. And we're seeing some more comments from the audience here. I think that we have had all the questions that we need to ask. And thank you so much for joining us, Jackie. And thank you for everyone who joined us on Facebook and YouTube. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Irene. This is an amazing experience.